Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Riju Banerjee, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I extend a warm welcome to all to today's ICS Wednesday seminar titled Navigating India's China Strategy on Climate and Energy. India's push towards decarbonization and clean energy is framed against the backdrop of self-reliance in establishing secure supply chains with regards to green technologies and critical minerals. Recent studies, however, suggest that these goals and India's larger move towards decarbonization would be informed by its reliance on China. This presents a strategic dilemma for India, wherein it must find ways to compete with China while also cooperating with it to meet its climate objectives. In the process, India must avoid possible points of contention which could disrupt and delay its clean energy transition. The existing body of literature on strategic engagement with China, moreover, is produced from the perspective of the global north, offering limited value to India. In this context, developing a framework to guide India's engagement with China that is sensitive to the history of India China engagement on climate and clean energy becomes a crucial priority. Drawing on this history of interaction since the Rio Conference in 1992, this seminar highlights key lessons learned from India's engagement with China and argues for the need to build a body of research that provides evidence based insights on the opportunities and risks involved in India China climate diplomacy. The presentation also relies on expert policy workshops and stakeholder interviews in order to analyze the basis of strategic cooperation between the two countries on climate and energy issues. Our speaker for today's seminar is Dr. Pooja Vijay Ramamurthy. She is a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Her research focuses on the techno-economic, social, and political dimensions of the global climate agenda, with a special emphasis on India's climate diplomacy. She holds a PhD in Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy from Princeton University, where she also received the Prize Fellowship for Social Sciences. Our chair for today's seminar is Dr. Partha Mukhopadhyay, an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. He holds a PhD in economics from New York University and has published extensively on issues like urbanization, infrastructure, and comparative development in India and China. His recent publications include The Modern City, Electric, Smart, and Green, featured in the India Infrastructure Report 2024. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive seminar. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Mukhopadhyay.
Thank you, Raju, and welcome to this workshop on something that's obviously quite important. Um, Pooja has been working on this for a while now, and we look forward to her presentation. The framing is interesting. Uh, we obviously seem to have a large dependence in China, especially in our renewable energy sector. At the same time, the presentation promises to address how we might want to reimagine this engagement. So I'll reserve further comments until after the presentation. So Pooja, the screen is yours. About 30 to 40 minutes should be good for you.
Sorry, I'm just going to share my screen.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ICS, for having me here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm not a China hand. I'm actually a climate and energy hand. So if I say anything, which doesn't make sense, please feel free to call me out on that. Yes, I think around half an hour to 40 minutes should be more than enough to complete the presentation. And thank you, Arto, as well, for your introduction, and Reju too. I think you summarized the breadth of the work quite well. Um, so, uh, yes. So this is actually a joint project which is being done between the Institute of South Asia Studies in US, as well as CSCP. And on the CSCP side, it on the project has been me, Pooja, Constantino, Xavier, who leads the foreign policy team, and Hruti Jargad. And from the NUS team is has been Karthik Nachiappan working on this. So just a little bit of background. We've started this project officially in March, but we've been researching this question, I think, since the beginning of the year, and our mapping and so forth. So I'm just going to present kind of the 1 year of what we've done and what we see a little bit that we want to do in the next year as well. So I think already this has been brought up by Treju, that India has very ambitious domestic energy transition policies. Um, and we have our 2030 targets. We want to double the amount of renewable energy capacity, and we want 30% penetration of EVs. There are other very technical things, like we want to reduce our emissions in intensity, and as well as we want to do a lot of afforestation for kind of carbon sinks. So we have a lot of aggressive goals, and at the same time we also are trying to enter these global green value chains, of green goods, whether it's the raw materials and critical minerals, or it's actual solar, wind, batteries. We're trying to also become kind of under our Make in India and Viksit Bharat, become a manufacturing hub for these green tech. Um, and of course, one thing, which India highlights again and again, is that we are going to work a lot on climate adaptation. And then the neighborhood becomes important because we have a lot of shared environments, including the Himalayan regions, a lot of transboundary water resources, which will all be affected by climate change in the neighborhood. And also, there are, I don't know, there was a recent statement by the Chinese diplomats which said, we can share lessons to tackle air pollution, because China also faced very similar issues as Delhi is facing now. So there's also a lot of domestic issues both in China and India, where shared learning could be important to tackle climate change and clean energy, but also kind of these environmental issues which are related as well. um, but I think, as stated, there is geopolitical contestation, and there's a lot of dependence on China as well. China contributes to 80% of the countries of India's REEs, or these rare earth elements. And we are also completely dependent on critical minerals. The share is reducing, but our total volumes are going up from our imports with China. So according to my research assistant, Noel, who has kind of worked on this piece, so while India is diversifying, it's is actively trying to diversify who it gets its minerals from. So I think we're getting a little more from Mongolia and Japan in the past few years. But the volumes from China are still going up because our demand is also going up. While India attempts to become this global manufacturing hub, the truth is that PV solar components across the value chain, are 10% more than what they are in India to manufacture, and wind turbines are actually 60% more. So you can still see that the costs as well are not yet at par with China. So India, to because of these low costs within China, and to protect domestic manufacturing, and kind of to encourage domestic manufacturing, has kind of taken a lot of steps. So this is a study by some colleagues at the University of California in San Diego. They've done a really good paper. If any of you are interested in this topic, I would tell, they kind of map all the India-China green trade that is going on. It took 3 years for them to come out with this very brilliant paper, but it's quite granular, and they kind of show for different components and everything what is India's kind of relationship trade engagement. So while we have this very strong dependence and trade engagement, at the same time we are putting a lot of restrictive policies as well, such as anti-dumping, local domestic content, to make sure that Indian industries are also protected, but at the same time, and to build up our own capacity. But China is aware that we're trying to build up our own capacity, so they are also making moves on their side, where they are silently withdrawing their technical personnel, I don't remember when, but around a year or a little more ago, there was actually an unofficial announcement made by the Chinese government telling companies that do not go and help Indian companies kind of build up the capacity in the EV space. There was actually like a government announcement made. So there is a lot of push pull factors within this green trade as well. We all know that there was a recent rare earth magnet crisis, which was not only for India, which was aimed mainly at the US tariffs, but we also got affected by it. And this actually called for the Indian EV industries to come together and say that we want to slow down the pace in which we manufacture our EV industry, our EV cars, because if we don't have these rare magnets, then we're not going to be able to deliver. And if you see recently, I was very upset, but also, I mean, it makes strategic geopolitical sense that the EU also has kind of thinking of slowing down their EU manufacturing because of this heavy dependence on China and how China sometimes weaponizes this. So I think there are a lot of geopolitical issues at play. um and yeah, but the truth is India will be dependent on China for its green tech in the short and medium term. I mean, in the long term, maybe we can make some robust policies to get out of this dependence, but the truth is at this moment 3 out of 4 power plants in India do use Chinese equipment. And also, given that there's going to be dependence is going to be there for the medium term, and there are other shared climate challenges in urbanization and other environmental issues, perhaps, I mean, we're not saying India should, we're saying it is worth investigating. So we always frame this research question as not India and China should engage, but is there any merit, and whether India should, and if this engagement occurs, then what could it look like, and would it be beneficial for India, and if so, what sectors, what are the risks and opportunities. So that's kind of the framing of the whole project that we want to look at. But basically, as you can see, this graph shows that we are continuing, the trade is going increasingly with China rather than going down. So does this call for more diplomatic engagement to make sure that we don't get supply chain disruptions and etc., to hasten our own energy ambitions, transition ambitions, or should we stay in status quo, let B2B do whatever it wants to? Those are kind of some of the questions that we want to see. So we thought the most important thing, and this is the piece that Shruti and I worked on, was to understand the past. So in this sense, what has been historical engagement between India and China on climate and energy? Because it's not a new thing. There has been quite a lot of engagement. And what are the institutional and diplomatic channels and strategies on which India has and continues to engage with China on climate and energy? And then we want to understand whether and how, as I said, India can leverage strategic points to engage in today's geopolitical context. As you already mentioned in the abstract, so there is a lot of existing literature on climate partnerships with China, but they all come from the global north. So Joanna Lewis at Georgetown has done this really excellent work where she does, for the past 10 years, she's kind of studied how countries have international climate partnerships with China, but her cases are Germany, US, Denmark, and I think Brazil. But on Brazil, is also, it's very small on biofuels. And so you can see that there is no real global south understanding of how engagement with China on climate and energy is happening beyond China being a donor, or like going and creating or investing in solar, etc., in African countries and things like that, but not really how partnerships or diplomacy is happening. The studies with India have tended to examine the engagement at multilateral. So there's some excellent work. If you read Navroz Tabash's books as well, on the Handbook of Global Climate Change, it talks about how India and China have engaged on climate change at multilaterals, and what has India's stance been, China's stance been, but not so much, how the bilateral engagement has happened. The few bilateral engagement studies which have happened in a phase between 1993 to 2015, when but they're a bit dated because there are two things that come up. One is that during that stance, India and China were diplomatically engaging quite well. The second thing is that these studies focus at a period before China emerged as kind of the dominant supplier in the green supply chain. So they don't take into consideration today's geopolitical realities. And I think that is important when you're trying to frame and this India China strategy on climate and energy. So, what are our methods? So, for the historic mapping, we use a lot of secondary official exchanges between the Indian and Chinese government. So, from the MEA repositories, we went and looked at all the 44 documents, and we chose a time period from 1993 to 2024. This so why 1993? Because that's when the Rio Conference on Climate Change happened. That's when really global movement around climate change kind of solidified, and so that standard to use that time period till date. And then we had a total of 44 documents which we then categorized, and I'll show you how we categorize them in the next slide, in order to do our analysis. And then we to chart these future strategic entry points, we use primary interviews with experts in India and China, and we had two workshops where there were Chinese and Indian participants, one in India and one in the National University of Singapore as well. So this is kind of what the data looks like for our mapping exercise. So you can see, and this is was all done by Shruti. So it was a very deep dive, where she kind of went in and got all the agreements and made this table where we found out which year was it happening, what type of engagement was it, an agreement, an MOU, was it a dialogue, or was it just a statement? So a lot of these things, which organizations were involved, because we wanted to do the institutional mapping and understand which institutions were actually engaged in this. What was the content of these exchanges, so we could categorize them, and then what were the mechanisms. So these mechanisms are mainly, was it scientific, was it more business to business, was there more government and kind of high level dialogues. So we also categorized all of this in a table. Um, and this is some of the analysis that was done. As can be seen in this graph, that between 1993 to 2019 there has been some kind of engagement. There have been 15 MOUs, 7 joint statements, 13 agreements, since dialogues, and 1 plan. There was nothing between 1994 to 2002, so that's why there's a gap over there. And then after 2020 as well, things come to a halt. But the maximum point of engagement was between, I think, would say around 2008 to 2015. I mean, this could be because diplomatic engagement between the two countries was quite strong, but also I think it was between the Copenhagen COP and as well as between the Paris COP. So I think there was a lot of engagement going on at this phase as climate change was becoming, more and more of an important topic at that point.
Pooja, just a quick clarification. These are engagements limited to climate issues or
Climate and
engagement?
clean energy. So climate and clean energy.
Sure.
So,
So, not engagements on other fronts.
no, not engagement in other fronts. Some environmental issues are covered, but that's because they also come under climate and energy. Like under climate, you have air pollution and water waste management, etc. So a few environmental issues also, some mining from minerals, but not on like trade or I don't know, defense or food or other aspects. No, these are only for climate and energy that we've mapped. So yeah, and then these were the channels of which climate and energy engagements were happening. So as you can see, again, we see the most density during this period, as we said, between 2008 to 2015. A lot of kind of exchanges were happening, and the channels, we find that the most channels were kind of G to G, so they're government to government, institutional exchanges, delegations, and policy dialogues. But there was also a robust scientific exchanges happening on R&D facilities and infrastructure, a lot of technology exchange and training of personnel. But again, these were what was mentioned in the agreement, so doesn't mean that this was actually happening on ground. This was what was mentioned in the plan, so we don't know if these have actually occurred on ground. That we tried to get, but it was very hard to get that kind of information. So this is what was mentioned, or what channels were being mentioned in the agreements. And there was also an increasing focus on business and exchange capacity building. And I think one key area which India and China have been, I think, relatively successful in has been data and information sharing in that time period, but again kind of stopped after 2020 or 2015. That also stopped. So yeah, these were some of the channels mentioned in these agreements of how these exchanges will actually happen. um, yeah, and and then there was also a lot of topics that were mentioned on, within these agreements. A lot of topics were also mentioned, which were a lot around adaptation, mitigation, urban conservation, and environmental issues, climate and or clean energy, urban sustainability, clean coal, energy efficiency, energy security. So anything you would think of, was discussed under these topics. Um, and so I think the main kind of key findings from our historical mapping is that we can break this engagement into, three very clear phases. The phase one was in the 1990s to 2007. So over here, you can see a lot of early multilateral cooperation. So if you read a lot of memoirs of Indian diplomats at that point who were engaging, you would see that it was actually found that, the Chinese would come to India and kind of, talk to us about what should be the global South strategic stances. How can, India and China together be aligned, but particularly at the COPs to push global South narratives. I would say actually Indian voices, Indian think tanks such as CSE and Terry, etc., were kind of key in framing global South narratives for other global South countries, but for China as well, on, common but differentiated abilities of countries to transition, on the need to have differentiated transfer of technology from the global North to the global South. um, and also there was a lot of these kind of key arguments that came from Indian research and think tank organizations, and China as well was one of the countries that would kind of come to us and say, okay, what stance should we take at these COPs? So it was quite an interesting time when, India was looked at by China as a key a place for information, because at that time India was also one of the first countries, who did a study on does agricultural rice paddy cultivation, for example, actually impact climate change too much. And so these kind of studies were not being done in China at that point, but were being done in India. And but the bilateral engagement was not that strong at that point. It was very nascent. There was a few. There was one or two, agreements that were happening, or MOUs that were happening on mining of resources such as iron, bauxite, etc. And there was some environmental, urban sustainability, air pollution, waste to energy kind of projects as well. I think the key pun here was the 2002 hydrological data sharing plan that was kind of negotiated and agreed at that point, which is still in a place where kind of China set up the hydrological station and then India provides data. So that agreement, is, and vice versa, the data sharing, that was a key agreement that happened at that point. I think phase two is when there was a flurry of engagement. There was wide-ranging bilateral alignment. That's the time when all these sister city agreements, I think there were like 6 to 7 sister city agreements signed at that point on, and all of them kind of focus a little on climate and energy. Of course, they speak about other things as well, but a lot of focus on climate and sustainability. There was a lot of agreement around energy efficiency, clean energy. There's actually this India China strategic plan for climate change that was presented. This partnership document that was presented. And so you see a lot of activity here. Um, Going on between, I told you, Copenhagen and Paris, the COPs. But we also start noticing kind of at the end of this period that China, as it grows into being this big manufacturing hub and one of the largest emitters of carbon in the world, and with a lot of pressure from Western countries to transition out, that it also now has to kind of take a different stance. It cannot stick to the CBDR that, global South countries will decarbonize later and, Western countries have to take the lead. And then we see this really turning point during the 2014 when Obama went and visited China, and there was this agreement where China says, okay, we will also kind of take aggressive climate goals, but India was still kind of sticking to its, which it still does, which even this date, even if you see the last COP, India is still sticking to this global South countries' responsibility last, whereas China is now positioning itself as a leader of climate change. And so this started happening at that point, at the end of this period. And then by 2016 and 2024, then we see that India and China stances are completely different often. I think the only thing that they stick by is that global North countries have to hold accountability and the coal transition can happen at a slower pace. But otherwise, China is kind of positioning itself as the leader and kind of, China is also decarbonizing very aggressively. Like the pace that China is decarbonizing, I don't think any country can really compete with that because they manufacture a lot of goods in their own country, but they're also realizing the impacts of climate change on their own country because both India and China are in the top five most vulnerable countries to climate change. And so I think in that sense, in EVs, in batteries and everything, China is really, way advanced compared to India or any other country in the world. And then we start seeing, but the stances are different. There is no more any multilateral alignment either. And of course, I mean, I won't get into it too much because as I said, I'm not a China hand. As you all know, there are also these growing bilateral geopolitical tensions and these border disputes, etc., which then kind of just nullified any kind of engagement. I mean, leave climate and energy, just nullified any kind of engagement. And led to a lot of other diplomatic things. So then we see this asymmetries and this institutional breakdown. Um, so what have been the limitations of past engagements? So one was the scope of agreements were too vast. If you read each and every agreement, it wanted to deal with everything from energy as I said, from energy efficiency to wastewater management to urban, like each agreement was so wide. Every strategic economic dialogue as well just wanted to deal with every aspect of sustainability and environment. There were no clear focus areas. And I think that was one of the biggest reasons that not many of these agreements really led to any on ground efforts. They were always these very high level signaling kind of conversations without any on the ground implementation. And I think as time went on, with this misalignment between India and China, as also our trade deficit started increasing, as we realized that we cannot compete with the manufacturing capabilities of green tech in China. There were a lot of geopolitical realities, but Indian policymakers still kept engaging with China in a same way as they did previously, expecting that the CBDR, the Global South goal. So I think they were really blindsided when the US and China went ahead and signed this this agreement to lower carbon emissions, because Indians kept thinking that China's in the same, but China had moved on at that point when it came to climate and green tech. So I think these were some of the limitations of past engagement. And I think as Arthur said, that's why we're trying to say, okay, then how can you reimagine these engagements? Because now we're in a competitive conflict contestation, but at the same time we're dependent on them for this. So then how do you even start having these conversations? So where do we go from here? So I mean, I think one of the main things that I said is multilateral interests have very there's not alignment anymore. There is technology and knowledge sharing is not encouraged, and financial investments from China into India are kind of restricted. And of course, there's also this weaponizing from China and these barriers which are being put from both countries to for trade. And why do we think this project is important right now over the past year? Well, so today's geopolitical context is very different. The Western countries, which used to be champions of climate negotiations, themselves are stepping back. And India and China are both competing for global climate diplomacy. There have been emergence of many new institutional mechanisms which can maybe enable India and China to engage more. India and China seem to be thawing their relationship. I know there are ups and downs. You all know better than I do, but there does seem to be some openings, and we are thinking maybe climate and energy, maybe that kind of narrow opening between the two countries, maybe. So these were the two workshops that we did. One was in the 22nd of June, where we had both Indian and you can see some Chinese colleagues as well joining us. And then we did our first workshop so this was the launch event of our project, which we had started earlier, but this was the official event. And then in 22nd August, we got four Chinese scholars and four Indian scholars in a round table in Singapore, where we kind of discussed a lot of these issues that we're speaking about now to understand where are the openings. So kind of like a track two dialogue. We also interviewed 11 expert interviews, academics, political representative, diplomats, multilateral banks, World Bank, ADB, etc., from China and India to kind of understand what these reimagined futures could be. The outputs have been a paper that's underway that Shruti and I have written, but that's under review, so not yet come out. We have done this policy brief, Karthik, myself, and Constantino. We've had two op-eds, Shruti and me, in newspapers. We've done a podcast, also written a blog with an intern on how can we compare Indian and Chinese models of climate action. So these were some of the things that are the outputs that have come out of this project. And what are some of the windows of cooperation now? So I'm wrapping up. I'll take another 5 minutes. So what are these? So what are the big findings that came off from the workshops, from our interviews of how can we go ahead? Um, so as we said, there needs to be an identification of narrow areas of mutual interest. It cannot be it cannot be so large like like our previous engagements. Dr. Ambud Sagar from IIT Delhi specifically mentioned that you cannot work on issues that we are competing on. There needs to be some windows on issues that maybe we are not competitive on. um, and so what are some of these issues? Can be energy efficiency, carbon markets, green taxonomy. Working on exchanges of standards and norms. Working on sustainable agriculture, energy efficiency within the context of adaptation, waste to energy, urban sustainability. Working on things that are not going to become market level competitive, because the truth of the matter is that maybe India cannot even compete at that level, because China is so far advanced. So then we need to find some levels. So then in that case, India should come up with its own indigenous strategies of how to build its own green capacity, etc. But there is still spaces on working in these non-competitive areas. A scholar from SIIS, the Shanghai Institute of International Studies, told us that we are very interested in understanding how can India and Chinese carbon markets be like, is there any sense of how we can merge them or kind of align them? Is there any sense of how we can align green taxonomy so that investments become easier? So there are kind of things like that which the governments are which they could look into, which have come up from Chinese scholars as well. um, One thing that is really important is also came up was sharing governance and policy experiences. So, if, for example, a scholar from China told us, we are not able to replicate the Indian model of kind of grassroots entrepreneurship. We see a lot of these, at the rural level, at the decentralized level, a lot of sustainable agricultural entrepreneurship or solar entrepreneurship coming from India, which somehow we haven't been able to replicate. So we would like to learn how you have done that. Another scholar said, both the countries have to transition away from coal. We both are big economies which are very dependent on coal. And of course, technology is one aspect of it. We can keep putting solar and wind, but how are you going to ensure just transitions for those folks in the coal regions? Also, I know there are different political institutions in China and in India, but still there is this kind of interplay. I mean, that was what our blog found out. There's still this interplay of the central and local actors within climate governance, because at the end of the day, it is local actors who implement these climate policies. So then how do kind of local actors and the central government can coordinate around this? There are also a lot of monitoring and incentive practices, which I think can be shared. So, yeah. Another thing which came up is the role that India and China can both play at global platforms. So, one was about how we need to, of course, diversify our channels of coordination. So it can't only be at the COP. They also, or they also have to be these kind of smaller groupings where India and China can coordinate on climate change. So BRICS, SCO, BASIC, etc. And also the potential for China maybe to engage maybe as an observer institution or something into these newly created climate institutions which have been created by India, such as the ISA and CDRI, which work across the world in countries, but China has not been involved in this. Is there any role that, even if India is hesitant to make them a full member, can they play some kind of some role within these Indian institutions to kind of build trust and to enable some kind of engagement? When we spoke to ADB and the World Bank and these multilateral institutions, they were very, of course, they would love India and China to work together. And, they came forward and said, we would be happy to kind of be third party brokers, honest brokers was the statement, where we can kind of get these two countries to talk on some of these issues that I was talking about, such as norms and standards and investments and things like this. So that's comes to the point of these two countries have a lot to gain by coordinating their climate norms and then setting an example for the rest of the global south. So what are green goals? What are the green taxonomies? What are the standards and regulations for climate finance, and what are the adaptation metrics? I mean, this year at COP was actually a year where countries were supposed to come up for ways, the metrics in order to measure adaptation actions. So this is also something that India and China can coordinate on, to how do you kind of measure some of these things. Um, so the next thing is there are already a lot of subnational engagements. There were, like I told you, 6 to 7 sister city agreements. Can these be revived? Are these kind of lower hanging fruit here? And can then they be more local action? Like I was talking about urban sustainability, and it's going to be one of the topics on our second workshop in NUS in January as well. Can they be something around this, because it's a non-sensitive issue? It's not that politically fraught to deal with urban and sustainability, maybe waste to energy, maybe waste management, maybe the air pollution issues, water pollution issues. Are these some things that we can learn from China? um, can there be an increase in collaborative studies between academic institutions? Things again that are low risk, such as modeling energy futures, modeling climate scenarios. A professor did tell us that there's something going on between the Shanghai University and an IIT within India. But can these kind of be increased? These R&D things, and of course think tanks such as us and y'all can kind of enable policy government exchanges, as we're doing a track to dialogue, but also just at a larger scale can be more involved in these things. And I think the last point, which we realized is very, very important, which came out, especially by a gentleman, a Chinese gentleman, who was working in ADB, was telling us, there are a lot of other countries which do have politically sensitive relationships with China, such as the Philippines, Japan, and Indonesia, but particularly Philippines and Indonesia, who are actually engaging quite extensively on climate, energy, and minerals, the diplomacy with China. For example, Indonesia, I think within ASEAN, is the country that has the largest amount of investments in the clean tech and mineral space from China. So but they also have, in the South China Sea, they have some disputes with China. So can we learn on how these countries have engaged? Is there any merit in that? And see what strategies they have adopted to safeguard their economies, while at the same time ensuring that they are also part of China's value chain as well. So I think that's something we've been thinking a lot about. And even to I mean, and then of course there is global north cases which have been studied, but again those were also in a different geopolitical reality, more when, like, for example, if you see the German China case, it was when Germany was kind of enabling tech transfer to China, was then China could enable their energy transition with the solar panel story, right? So, but given this new geopolitical reality, is it even worth looking at how now global North countries are re-strategizing their engagement with China? These are some of the things we've been thinking about and which have come up during our workshops as well. So I'll conclude here with the future of the program. So now we are working on a paper too with NUS, with which are okay. Now we've seen some of the areas that India can engage on China with, but what are the risks and opportunities of engaging with these areas? And which areas give us the best opportunity, or which area should we not work in at all? And what strategies should India consider when engaging in China in these identified areas? So these are some of the questions that our paper two will answer. We're having a workshop on Jan 13th on India-China green trade with UCSD. If any of you is interested in this, please drop me an email. We would love to have the participation from someone at ICS as well. I'll send an invite out. But if any other institutions are here who would also like to come to this workshop, it's a closed door roundtable, which we're doing with the UCSD on understanding what are Indian perceptions towards this trade dependence with China. And then our second workshop is happening in January with NUS and Singapore, which we will have, again, we've already secured 4 Indian scholars and 4 Chinese scholars, which we will be talking about some of these issues that I brought up today, particularly on urban sustainability, carbon markets, grid integration, and financial instruments. So these are some of the topics that we'll be speaking about. No, no, Noel and I are working on an op-ed on urban sustainability. And then we have some, bigger ideas for the second year, which we're pondering because our funder is keen to continue encouraging us. But we want to, and I would love to hear some ideas from your end also on how we can take this forward. So, what are some of the ideas that for our second year? One we thought was looking at these different levels of government when India and China can engage on. Of course, one, you have the SCO BRICS, this kind of this multilateral level. Then you have G2G, which has been studied a lot, which has been done a lot. But then should we also be looking at more local and subnational experiments and activities? And these Hester-Hetty agreements, is that something that would be interesting for us to look at? So that's one idea. The other idea, as I said, was to study the cases of ASEAN countries, Indonesia and Philippines, to understand their strategic climate and energy engagement with China, and maybe even Germany and Japan. So, those were the two ideas that we had on how to take this project forward for the next year. And with that, I conclude. And please feel free to come in and give us all your feedback.
Thank you, Pooja. Quite an extensive view. And lots of questions, I'm sure. But Riju, do we have anything from the participants as of now?
We don't have any questions on the chat box right now.
So while people are formulating the questions, Pooja, let me sort of clip, check for some of the issues that you may or may not have been sort of looking at during your existing research. So, for example, you said you've examined these agreements quite extensively, the ones which 44 agreements you looked at. Could you give us a sense of the institutions who are engaged in these uh, structures? For example, are they scientific institutions from India, academic institutions, government departments? And the reason I ask that is to see whether usually it's in while sort of levels of bureaucracy do change quite a bit, especially in India. Uh, Institutions often have much longer lived uh, sort of human resources, and therefore re-engaging some of these things might be different coming from that part of the story, right? And similarly, especially when you're looking at the uh, kind of cases that you're looking at China, you think moving forward. Uh, the issue is whether we have a sense of the kind of implementing agencies uh, on the Chinese side and how they perhaps might differ on the Indian side. You mentioned the interest of the Chinese in the bottom-up story. But for example, let's say the Chinese investment in solar, which is roughly about, I think, 1,000 gigs now, is sort of, I think it went up about 4 times. About 5 years ago, about before the start of COVID, it was about 250 gigs. So, in terms of the implementing agencies, are they purely, and both on the supply and the demand side, are they all to the extent to which they're government, to the extent to which they're private, to what is the sense that we have in terms of trying to think through our ecosystem? Um, and most of this is to try and understand, as you said, China itself, when we look at the way the structure is put through, uh, there was a 4x increase in emissions, per capita emissions, I think, from 2000 to 2010. That's when it went very sharp, it's almost a vertical climb in the Chinese emission story. And concurrently, or almost soon after that, it started investing extremely heavily in green tech, and which is now sort of being deployed substantially. So, when we talk about the kind of time it takes to transform, we're talking about maybe a decade or so, which is so. What is it that uh, if I'm looking at in India, and you said that yes, in the short and medium term, perhaps the our options are limited. But if we are to sort of think of the longer term, and I'm talking about a 10-year time frame, what is it that one would need to do uh, um, to sort of achieve the kind of, or at least be broadly comparable with the kind of stage that China is now? So these three broad things, the first the first two based on what you've already done. The third, I'm inviting you to speculate, um, uh, to the extent that you would care to do so. Over to you, Pusha.
No, I think that's a very good point where we have said general institutions, scientific R&D, etc. We haven't really gone into, and maybe we should, we haven't really dug into, okay, if I'm saying a scientific institution, then which really institution am I talking about, right? Am I talking about the IITs or am I talking about the government scientific institutions? That we haven't done. Maybe worth going into that next level of granularity and at least mentioning it somewhere that, these are the kind of institutions, or kind of making a diagram of which institutions have been involved and seeing, I mean, one thing is, I don't we could attempt to see whether they have continued, maybe by doing some interviews with some of the institutions that continue coming up. That might actually make a lot of sense, going and interviewing those institutions which come up often in these agreements and seeing whether there has been continuance without us knowing. Like, yeah, even if G2G has stopped, as you said, sometimes these continue. That's a very good idea and direction. So I'll definitely take that into consideration. The second thing, we did try to do a Chinese, as you said, which are I did want my team, and maybe now Noel, who has joined us, can do this. We did try to see which are the agents, the institutional modeling, not the institutional modeling, the the governance structure of institutions for climate and energy and who is implementing what. But I realize it's very tough because I said I'm not a Chinese hand. I don't understand China. I understand India and climate and energy, but I don't necessarily understand the governance structures of China. So I thought I could not uh, give that the full justification. But and that is why also we limited our project to understand India's approach toward China. Originally we had proposed understanding India and China from both perspectives, but then we realized, to really understand Chinese perspective on India, you need a different level of expertise in China itself. So yeah, but I mean, I will, maybe we can see how to understand Chinese governance, or at least to a limited way, to understand which are the agencies most involved and how is it being implemented. Um, and This is also very true. Like right now, we have taken a very initial what has been the history and the present. But yes, if I think that is what our India China green trade on Jan 13th is going to be about. We're really going to see, okay, what now should India do to reach the same stage that China can? And, what are Indian perspectives on how do we really create this supply chain resilience that India keeps speaking about? How can we actually get there? So I think that's what our workshop on Jan 13th is doing to do, because that's what the UCSC folks are, more economists, more trade economists. So they are kind of in they're interested in understanding what are the institutional and structural changes that India can put ahead in order to really um, reach this kind of longer term transformation and wean off from this dependence. We have been looking mostly at the geopolitical angles, but of course, that's the point you raised is really important. Is really important as well. So these are some of my responses that honestly I don't have the answers. So a lot of these comments and they are worth investigating in the second phase of our work. Is there anyone else?
Yes. Mm, Rapai, would you let me ask you to come in? I see you have a question, but maybe you want to ask it yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Partha. Uh, am I audible?
Yes, you
Yes.
are.
Yeah. I was thinking of some of the things we can look at the India. I don't know, India, we are doing it, but China certainly started it. But some European countries have gone much ahead about the waste management and waste to energy and making useful products out of it. So are you looking at that? Because that is part of the story. Because recently we saw a lot of articles coming out in our dailies about the experiences of Beijing, how they reduce the pollution levels. So I am not arguing that only from China, but I think the pollution is one issue closely linked to the areas you are talking about, may not be directly. So I would like to get some of your comments. And is there any scope to understand more seriously about the waste management and waste to uh, products? Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, that is one of the op-eds that Shruti and I wrote, making air less toxic. Why has Beijing failed? Why has Delhi failed when Beijing succeeded? So, we do provide some insights, and I'm happy to share that article with you later. We do share some insights on how, Delhi can, I mean, even though there are different governance structures, how there are actually comparable lessons, that and we argue that actually the air pollution change in Beijing was very top down. There was a lot of protests and kind of social media uh, voices that were engaging to kind of make the Beijing government act, and kind of this community action is what led to the change in Beijing. So we kind of we call for kind of this decentralized approach, where even Delhi needs to take a more top-down approach to the air pollution issues. So I think that's very relevant. We actually even had a talk by a Princeton University PhD, one of my colleagues when I was there, who brought up this exact topic, that waste to energy is actually one of the topics the topic with the most maybe urban when you're talking about urban sustainability, one of the biggest issues that India and China can engage on as well. So I think point well taken, and I think this has come up during a lot of our stakeholder interviews as well, that air pollution, as you said, not directly engaged with climate change. Air pollution that Delhi is a whole thing on its own. But waste to energy, but that definitely worth investigating. But waste to energy also is something that's worth investigating. But I think I just want to draw a limit here, that we are only trying to identify areas that we can work on. We are not, we are in the foreign policy team, so the technique, and we can also kind of come up with, okay, which are the best institutional channels for this engagement to occur. But I think on the technical aspects of it, yeah, we may not be best. So how actually, what technology, which technology, where to do it, that might be a little beyond our scope. But I think identifying the areas and the institutional channels and some of the governance lessons on these topics is something that we can do.
All right. While we wait for the others, just to follow up on what Ms. Rabai was talking about, um, you mentioned that you have focused your effort on environment and climate change and clean energy. And I'm just, given the context that you have just said about what kind of areas of cooperation that could be put in place, uh, and the possibility that trust building, which is important at this point in time of China-India relations, some of it may be possible outside the climate space, and so on, which might then eventually have some effect on the climate side. But even within these climate kind of spaces, the kind of stuff that was just discussed in terms of waste recycling, let's say um, China would, given the pace of its adoption, would have uh, some early experience, at least earlier than ours, from where we could sort of take some uh, lessons or understanding. Let's say things on battery recycling, for example, and how exactly are we supposed to handle that part of the story? Or something that it must be happening right now. You mentioned the grid, so integration of renewable energies in the grid itself, uh, and how they are doing it, because they also have a large amount of installation, renewable energy installation in the grid, and the extent to which they're actually doing it. These are sort of actions that would be taken individually by countries and need not necessarily be sort of linked so much to trade. Of course, battery recycling, I'm sure there'll be a large Chinese import component in that process, and it's also true for solar PV generation in India. But is there any uh, interest or any structure that you see in these kinds of engagements at the broad level? Because the other idea that you had, which was engagements at different subnational levels, that may be, given the current tense relationship, I don't know how viable that would be. And especially also given the fact that unlike Chinese provinces, Indian subnationals have very limited authority to engage in dialogues by themselves. And then there are issues around, visas, structures, etc., that would automatically, unless it had the blessings of the federal government, would necessarily be difficult to engage in. So I'm just wondering, do you see any kind of uh, engagements essentially on technical knowledge and know-how of these kinds of structures on recycling, on grid integration and things like that?
So
And
those are everything you mentioned is exactly the areas we see. So I told you our workshop number 2 is going to kind of key into some of these areas. So one is going to be urban sustainability, with Rapai mentioned, of which I'm sure waste to management would come up. And the second one is going to be around grid integration for RE. We're going to have a panel on that as well, where we're getting someone from IIT and from a Chinese institute as well, who's going to talk about these issues. So I think everything you have kind of hit the nail on the head. These are the issues that we are going to be dealing with. And I'm happy to hear. I mean, no one has mentioned that yet because, for example, we were speaking with someone who works a lot on transboundary water resources, and she actually mentioned that subnational innovation is already happening at these kind of borderlands, and maybe that's the way to go. So this is the first time I'm hearing that maybe that may actually not be the way to go. So that's something we'll have to think about as well. I'm just going to be back. Someone is at my door. I'm just going to be back in a minute. Maybe if anyone else has any questions.
yeah, Poonam, would you have Alka? Do you have any questions at this point in time?
Sir, is
Yeah.
there a problem?
Hello? Hello?
Yeah. I was just checking if there's any questions from the other participants going forward. Uh,
While we wait for questions, I had one if it's okay for me to
so
ask.
go ahead, Viju.
Yeah, right. You mentioned this divergence in policy positions on climate change between India and China since 2014, 2015. Now, one of the ways in which those divergences sort of manifest is also China's increasing focus on climate mitigation as opposed to India's more focus on climate adaptation. And you also mentioned that this is an area on climate adaptation specifically where there can be more cooperation. So could you like talk a little bit more about what that cooperation would sort of like look like or materialize as?
I wouldn't say that the divergence has been that China is focusing more on mitigation than India has. I think, as Partho said, China has just really aggressively put industrial policies that have allowed its mitigation ambitions to grow at a rapid pace, at a stage that India may be in only the next 10 years. But India has always, I mean, at the Paris Agreement itself, India was, when we started the International Solar Alliance, when we put a lot of solar investments, I think 1 billion investment, I mean, one, they had a goal, so India has always wanted to also do mitigation activities. It's just that it's going to take us some time to reach there. I would not also make the statement that China has not focused so much on adaptation so much. They have also focused on adaptation. It's just that mitigation has now become mitigation technologies have now become an issue of geopolitical contestation. Like, so manufacturing of a lot of these minerals of EVs, of magnets, of solar panel, winds. These are all become very competitive industries, and so it's unclear. I mean, so of course, in my wish list, it would be amazing if India and China could engage on these, and as Partho said, a lot of tech transfer, capacity building. If these exchanges could happen on these issues, I would be very happy. But seeing the competitive angle, I don't see it happening to a large extent. India has also restricted. I mean, India has also restricted its FDI investments from Chinese companies. I mean, I'm sure you know the story of MG as well, where now JSW Steel is kind of becoming the majority partner, even though that was, I think, one of the most successful Chinese green investments into the country. I myself have an MG EV Windsor car, so I think in that sense you see a lot of these, you see a lot of these engagements happening. But so then what are the low hanging fruits? What are the non politically sensitive issues which are not competitive but where there's still a lot for countries to engage on? And I think that's when some of the suggestions by Partho and Rapai as well come in, where okay, then you can look at more adaptation and urban sustainability. You can learn, okay, they have gone way far advanced in grid integration. China is also far advanced in carbon markets. India is just trying to now set up its, is trying to set up its carbon markets. Green taxonomies. China already has a document on green taxonomies. Can we learn something from there? So that's, and also, as I said, this COP was supposed to be the COP of setting up the adaptation metrics. So the metrics on how countries kind of measure adaptation, that is going on in their countries. So can India, in India and China being the top five, both are the top five countries most vulnerable to climate change. Can they work together, or kind of come together on, or learn from each other on these adaptation metrics? Is there something there? So it's I think the more divergence, that's what I see as kind of going ahead. But what I meant by the divergences were at the multilateral stances. So what happened is that because China became such a big, I mean, and some of it is obviously economic rationale as well within China, right? It's not that they're doing it only out of the global common goods, but because they have become the majority provider of clean goods, of green goods. So they also want to expand their market. So now kind of a Trumpian narrative of dig baby, that kind of, that kind of narrative, comes up, then that's going to be a problem for them because they still need markets where they can sell their green tech as well. So in this way, they have also positioned themselves then as a leader of green trade, of the climate movement. They're like, we'll take over Trump's mantle. We will go ahead and make aggressive climate change moves within our country, mitigation needs. So a lot of it, of course, is their geopolitical positioning as well. It's not coming only out of good-heartedness that we will take up the climate championship. It's a lot of their motivation, internal domestic motivation as well, because they have a glut of production. Actually, they have so much internal competition now in these industries that they have a glut of production of a lot of these green goods, which, and they need to find markets for. Now, could India be one of those markets? Well, that's a sensitive issue, right? Because we want to protect our industries as well. Um, so that's why I say there have been these divergence of stances. When, if you see, at one point India and China used to be very closely aligned, a very, and of course I would still say they are a bit aligned at the at the Glasgow 2021 COP. I think both India and China were one of the staunchest countries to come together and say we will not phase out coal, we will phase down coal. So there is sense, and we spoke someone who was a climate negotiator at the MOEFCC, and they were like, we have very open conversations with our Chinese colleagues at these COPs. It's not like, even there's any there's tensions. We have very open conversations with China on what are their strategies, what are our strategies. It's just that there is a divergence in priorities based on domestic capacity also, of at these international gatherings. So it makes sense for India to say that, we need to do certain things to reach the development when China has already reached that stage of economic growth. But India still needs to reach that stage of economic growth. Um, when India's per capita emissions are like, I think, very, very low, and China is now, one of the leading per capita emissions. So it makes sense for China to then peak its carbon emissions while we still need space to grow. So a lot of it comes from domestic priorities as well. Um, and some of this is harder than to detangle and engage with each other. So that is why we want to find some issues that are, that you can find common ground on.
Thank you, Pooja. Um, I don't see any further questions from the audience, unless there's a problem with the raise hand option or something. So finally, if as a quick uh, final thought, I just want to um, ask you. You mentioned that you were handicapped in some sense by the China story.
Hmm.
Uh, on the other hand, I would suspect that Shruti would be, at least given her previous association with the ICS itself, uh, would be somebody who would be sort of positioned to sort of explore those kinds of angles. Is that something that uh, you're looking at, or just outside the scope of the project at this point in
No, no,
time?
no, no, no. I mean, that would have been great, except she has, as you know, now moved on to the, she's doing a
Sure,
fellowship
I
now.
sense, yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So of course that would have been the goal. We do have Noel Teratil who has joined us. He was also a
Yeah.
Schwartzman fellow and has some China experience. But yeah, I mean, Shruti would have ideally been positioned to do that, and we had initially envisioned that as a role. But given the transition now, I think that's we will have to kind of rethink. Um,
Restructure the priorities very well. Does your colleague Noel want to comment on anything at this time? This time?
but Noel, if you have any thoughts or you want to bring in your experience on the Indonesia China story as well, please feel ahead to come in. Is he on? I don't know.
Uh, he's been asked to unmute, so hopefully he'll be able to do so. Yeah,
I I don't know if he's on.
he, he is on. The question is,
But I just want to say that this has been very helpful, especially your comments. Though I think the initial three comments you made, I will definitely take into consideration. I think immediately after this, I will go back to the table we have and start looking at the institutions which have been involved, and also I think this more forward-looking vision of not only concentrating on how to move away from dependence, but really in 10 years, where do we want to be, like, as a country? I mean, in this, do we want to be in the same stage China is? Do we want to take an alternative path? I think, that are some things. I think Noel is, I sent him a WhatsApp as well, not able to get through. So maybe,
okay. So,
Hi, I'm
uh,
here.
oh, okay.
Sorry,
you
I
are
had some
very
issues
well.
with.
So, okay, Noel, applause
Yep.
yours.
No, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
So, I was asking whether you'd like, given the fact that you are part of the project and you've been hearing the discussion, is it something you'd like to add to it? I think Pooja mentioned something about Indonesia and the Indonesia-China cooperation, especially in the
Right.
light of the final story, as you said, in terms of looking at models where, despite uh, some conflictual countries have continued to cooperate on specific issues. Is there something that you want to bring to the table on those issues, or something else that you might want to address as part of this group?
Right. Yep. Thank you for that. I think the way Indonesia deals with China is quite strategic. It's been able to leverage Chinese investments in a way where it can make the most of the value it can offer without compromising on strategic autonomy. And I think when we look at China from the Indian perspective, we need to also understand that working with China doesn't have to be a one-way road or necessarily an over dependence on it. It's simply a matter of how we leverage those benefits that we can get out of China. And this means hedging our risks. For example, if we are going to work on, let's say, building an EV ecosystem, I think China is a great partner to work with. But while we do that, we also need to understand that we don't necessarily have to be overprotective about preventing Chinese investments into coming into India. But at the same time, we need to ensure that the technologies and areas where we're getting Chinese investments don't make us overly dependent or do not restrict our own strategic ambitions vis-a-vis working with other players in the region. And I think in some corners of at least the China space, there seems to be an apprehension where working with China seem in kind of a very hawkish perspective that it can compromise India's strategic interests. But I feel that it's a matter of nuance, and I think oversimplification of this India-China relationship can compromise genuine cooperation.
Thank you, Noel. So, if there are no further questions, Riju, do you want to make any closing comments, Pooja?
No, I just want to say
Sure.
thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. As I said, I'm usually in the climate and energy circle, so very happy to be giving this talk in the China circle. And also, yeah, I would love to, any as I said, would also love to have you at the some ICS folks at the India China Green Trade. So I will ask Shruti maybe who's the right person to be inviting from ICS, and and thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Thank you, Pooja. So, so thank you so much. Mm, Raju, why don't you take this away?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chair. With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. We thank Dr. Ramamurthy and Dr. Mukhopadhyay for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today and would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar. Further information regarding our events can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today.